hidden beneath one of Britain's most famous landmarks, extraordinary secrets are being unearthed. The Tower of London, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, stands as one of the most important historic places in England. For nearly 1,000 years, its walls have borne witness to royal triumph and tragedy, intrigue and imprisonment. It's easy to think of that history as immovable, set in stone. But the truth is, the tower's story is still being written. Today I've come to meet buildings curator, archaeologist and broadcaster Alfred Hawkins, who has led a once-in-a-generation dig at the tower, uncovering groundbreaking discoveries that are changing our understanding of its history.
Alfred, so many congratulations on this truly groundbreaking dig here at the Tower of London, and also for the peer-reviewed articles that have accompanied it.
Thank you.
Can you start by letting us know why this excavation has taken place?
Yes, of course. So the excavations that we've just completed were located outside the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, and they're being undertaken in order to enable access for anybody into that amazing space. There are a few qualifiers here. So the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula is one of our most important historic buildings. It's built in 1519, 1520, and has been the parish church of the tower ever since. It's known no other use. It is still a working chapel. It regularly holds concerts, baptisms, marriages, remembrances, and weekly services, that kind of thing. So it is incredibly important for us that anybody who wants to use that chapel for the purpose for which it was built is able to access that place. It's also incredibly important for various narratives. So those of Anne Boleyn, of Lady Jane Grey, of Catherine Howard, and countless other people who were either executed or died at the Tower of London and then buried in the chapel. It's also just beautiful and a space that everybody should be able to enjoy. And so Historical Palaces has made the decision to undertake this excavation with the purpose of installing a retractable stair lift, which will be hidden when it's not in use. So I defy anyone to come and point out the lift when it's completed. But that will enable this place to be accessed by anybody, whether or not you're in a wheelchair, whether or not you have other additional access needs. You will be able to get into the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. And this is fundamental to everything else. So Historical Palaces don't do research excavations. We don't just dig around looking for things. All of the archaeological work that we do is tied to project work. So the excavation that we have done has enabled the installation of the lift. We've not gone further, despite finding some incredibly interesting things at the bottom that could be better understood if we excavated further. But we always try and preserve as much archaeology there as possible. But the key important thing is that this excavation has been justified by, if you want to come to your daughter's wedding at the chapel of St. Peter of Vincula and you are in a wheelchair, you can now do that. If you have any other access needs and you just want to come to engage with it as a place of worship or a place of historic interest, you will be able to do that. And it's that element of our work, which is the physical side of kind of reaching further, enabling more people to actually visit the tower and to feel comfortable and to feel as though their needs are being responded to.
That really is so exciting. So my next question is about the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. You mentioned in your latest article that the chapel hasn't received much attention in historiography. Why do you think that is?
I think the chapel is, or has broadly been taken for granted in the kind of scholarship around the tower because of the excavations that occurred in 1876 and the very large publication that came out of that, which is written by D.C. Bell. The chapel's history is quite a weird thing within the Tower of London because it is so central to the community of the tower. It is the spiritual heart of the fortress. However, most of the research that we do at Historical Palaces is focused around the project work that we do. And so if there's conservation work on the Bywood Tower, there will be a lot of research on the Bywood Tower. I'm just fortunate that in my time at the Tower of London, we've been able to do multiple major projects on the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, which means I'm enabled to do that research. But I'm definitely standing on the shoulders of previous curators, George Roberts, Jeremy Ashby, various other people who've all done incredible research on the chapel. It's just now that through the work that we're doing, we're able to uncover so much more about its history.
So you mentioned in your latest article that there have been historically some issues with exhuming human remains from a royal peculiar, and that was the subject of your previous article. Did that pose any problems in this excavation? And if so, how did you overcome them?
It didn't pose any issues with the excavation that we've recently completed, but that's because of the work that I had done previously. So this is transporting us back to 2018, when we began thinking about how to enable access into the chapel. We considered all different means and ways of getting people in there who needed additional access requirements. And it turned out that the only way in which we could do that in a way that would minimize the damage to the site was through a lift. When we decided that, obviously there would be an archaeological component to it, digging a large hole in what is a burial ground. And so that begins to turn a number of cogs to do with different laws. So we are a scheduled ancient monument here at the tower, which is the highest level of protection that a historic building can have. But churches, cathedrals, places of burial are all protected by different laws, principally the Care of Churches measure, but are also bound by different permission systems, principally through faculty, which is a permission that you get from a local diocese. In the case of royal peculiars and, well, chapels royal are all royal peculiars, but not all royal peculiars are chapels royal, which makes things slightly different. But in general, royal peculiars are exempt from the diocese within which they sit. They exist to serve the monarch. And so they are not answerable to the hierarchies who would usually grant you those permissions in order to exhume human remains. And so this creates a bit of a sticky problem because we are bound by the laws of the United Kingdom. And so we have to comply with the Burials Act and various other things. The chapel just didn't have any mechanisms by which they could give us that approval. And so the first body of work I did around the legislative side of the chapel was trying to work out precisely where that designation began and ended and how it had changed throughout its history. And the principal conclusion that I found was that the chapel is a royal peculiar now, but that had been stripped in the 16th century. The only problem is that through a kind of combination of contempt for any kind of authority and assumed privilege of the tower, after that designation was stripped, they just continued to act like it for 500 years. And so the rededication in the 1960s was the most important part. And that rededication as a chapel royal did not mention a burial ground. And so from that point of view, it's fairly easy to split the jurisdiction of the chapel into chapel royal and royal peculiar, which is answerable to the sovereign, and then the burial ground, which is answerable to the Diocese of London. And so by doing all of that work, I was able to create a system by which historical palaces could apply for that permission to do that work. And so that was quite a lot of work, and is a relatively niche area of interest. But by doing all of that, it enabled us to have those measures in place for the excavation that we just did outside the chapel this year in 2025. That's the kind of specific complexity of the tower. In general, when you're dealing with human remains, we try to work by what we call dignity and respect. And that is to provide those individuals with as much dignity and respect as we possibly can. And that's done principally by the archaeologists on site, who take extreme care with all of the individuals that we exhume and all of the human remains that we exhume. In terms of a kind of archaeological methodology point of view, it did make the dig much more time consuming and much more complicated than any that HRP has previously done before. So the excavation we did this year was about 60 cubic meters of spoil to remove, which is quite a lot, but every single teaspoon of earth that was removed from the site had to be sieved by hand in order to remove individual pieces of human remains that we call either disarticulated human remains or charnel. And so there's extra layers that you need to put in place in order to ensure that you provide that dignity and respect. And that also continues after the excavation. So if we undertook an excavation here in Mint Street, we would find artifacts and they would be assessed and then they would be returned to us and they would be part of our collection. As a point of principle, we don't accession human remains into our collection. They are not our property, they are people. And so for this project, once the human remains have been removed and are going to be assessed by the archaeological contractor, Preconstruct Archaeology, they will then return to us and they will be kept securely locked away from anybody having access to them. And following the additional scientific work that we need to do, all of those individuals and the individual pieces of bone that we've recovered will be reinterred into the crypt of St. Peter ad Vincula. So it's a very long-winded way of saying that from a kind of legal point of view, no, there weren't any additional complexities because we'd already done that work. But from an actual archaeological point of view, it was incredibly complex because medieval people never had any idea that they would remain in the place that they were buried for any length of time. Burial plots were reused over and over and over again. But we want to give these people as much dignity and respect as we possibly can when we're dealing with their remains.
So beyond the human remains, you uncovered a mortar surface, which is likely linked to an earlier chapel. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and what it can tell us about the chapels that existed on that site?
So this is one of the really difficult things about archaeology in general. And I will preface this answer with the only thing that I think makes someone either a bad historian or archaeologist or anything is having the inability to change your mind when presented with new evidence. So the surface that you're referring to, we found initially in the 2019 trial excavations. And it was hugely interesting because it was covered over with a layer of compacted ash. And this, we think, related to a event where the previous chapel, built by Edward I between 1286-87, burnt down and then was replaced in 1519, 1512 with the current chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. And so during our trial excavations, we had a very limited area that we excavated, and we found a layer of compacted ash and then a mortar surface that was incredibly thick and looked like a kind of high status floor, or at least a bedding for a floor. And so in the initial publication for that work, the extrapolation was that this is representative of a building. It's beneath that burnt layer. The only building that we know existed on that spot prior to that is Edward I's chapel. And so I can't remember exactly how I phrased it, but I think it was along the lines of this could be associated with this building. During the excavations this year, we have gone far deeper and had a much larger area of excavation. And so we were able to more definitively frame that layer within the context. And now it appears as though it's probably a annex to Edward I's chapel built during the reign of Henry VII. We've only been able to answer that because we have a much larger body of evidence. Because we excavated through that surface, we subsequently found the footings of what we are almost certain are Edward I's chapel, and that surface was outside of it. And so it's one of those things where every single time you write a publication, particularly when you're dealing with archaeological excavations, is you enhance your own arguments and you change your mind and you create a better understanding of what came before. So because this excavation is much larger and we've had the opportunity to actually go through that mortar surface, we've been able to uncover more layers in the stratigraphy or the kind of build-up of the site. And so we've been able to create a more enhanced understanding of the site. So in effect, the 2019 excavation publication that was released this year, because these things take an age to write, is now wrong. But that will be resolved through the publication that comes out of this work, which will be much more extensive and draw on more of that evidence. But that's one of the crucial things about contributing to archaeological understanding and historical understanding more broadly, is if we had waited and waited and waited and waited to publish the results of the 2019 excavation, we may never have done the 2025 excavation. We may have decided that we weren't going to install this lift. And so there was no reason to hold back that information for fear that it would be proven wrong. The key thing is sharing the information that you have, making reasonable assumptions. And then when you do the next excavation, you're able to answer them more fully or extrapolate on things and say, we initially thought this was this, but now we think it's this. So in the 2025 excavations, we've actually discovered what we believe are the remains of an annex, potentially built by Henry VII, which is that mortar surface we had initially thought may have been part of Edward I's chapel. Beneath that, we then found massive footings, which are almost definitely part of Edward I's chapel. And so we were able to rule out that surface's relationship to those footings. And then beneath that, we were able to find elements that we think may have been related to a chapel built on the site by Henry III. And beneath that, walls which may have been built during the reign of Henry I. And then beneath that, there's also, and this always happens, it's always in the corner of the excavation, at the very bottom of the excavation where you're not going any further. There is a building that predates everything and appears as though it may be pre-conquest in nature. And this is one of the tricky things about the chapel, is we know there's been a chapel there since around 1110, and we know that there have been subsequent chapels built broadly in the same space, but we don't know why that place was chosen. And typically in England, Anglo-Saxon sites tend to get redeveloped, and then they, in at least kind of old towns, the church is still broadly in the same place. And so if we are able to, well, we'll never be able to say this is a pre-conquest church that is the precursor for everything that comes before it. But that's one of those things that we will make a reasonable argument about, but we will be honest that that's all the information that we have. And this is a good point about including all of the information that you have. So if we didn't include those deposits that we may not fully understand or may only have kind of reasonable ideas about what they are, they wouldn't be able to be assessed by other people, and particularly within the context of future excavations. And so it's one of those things. You don't want to be a kind of Victorian antiquarian who finds a single course of brick and says, I have found Troy, or something along those lines. But you do want to include all of the information that you have and use research, particularly archival research and work accounts, in order to interpret that as best you can. But it's the curse of archaeology that every single generation of archaeologists is proving the previous one wrong through either enhanced scientific techniques, additional excavation, or more detailed archival research. And so I will go through the publication by D.C. Bell from 1876 and go, well, that's clearly wrong. How could you possibly have thought that? But in 100 years, someone will be going through all of my stuff and going, that's clearly wrong. Alfred was obviously a complete idiot. We have to make the arguments that we can with the body of evidence that we have, and making sure that it's published is a key element of that, because too often people will undertake excavations, not publish things, and then die, and that information dies with you. And archaeology, particularly in comparison to kind of the study of history and things like that, is destructive. All of the deposits that we excavated in 2025 have been destroyed, and they are currently being replaced with a lift. They've been destroyed in an incredibly methodical and delicate way in order to understand what they are, but they can never be put back. And so we have to be absolutely sure that we are passing that information on, or what we call preservation by record, enabling future people to use that information in order to make those arguments and to prove us wrong. But it's a great joy to be able to be enabled to do that and to take so much time and spend so much time kind of delving into the history of what is my favourite building at the tower.
That really is so exciting. And I have to say, for someone who isn't an archaeologist, it has been a real joy to observe and learn from this whole process. In your testing, you uncover the remains of 3 individuals who have been studied. Can you tell me about them and what it can tell us about the other people who occupied the Tower of London beyond kings and queens?
Yeah, and I mean, that's a really important point for the entirety of these excavations. The Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula has been the parish church of the tower since at least the 12th century, possibly before. And primarily it served as a place of joy, of love, of commitment, and of worship, and of grief and sadness and burial. So we have records from 1550s to about 1872 when the last burial occurred. And there are tens of thousands of entries for burials, for baptisms, for marriages and things like that. So what we think we know of the chapel, which is those grand stories of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard and Lady Jane Grey, are really the punctuation in that story. So these excavations give us an opportunity for the first time ever to actually engage with the most sensitive and the most delicate source base for the lives of those people before those people who are in the records. It's allowing us to engage with the community of the tower in the Tudor and medieval period. So the 3 individuals that we excavated in 2019 all dated from the Tudor period. We think broadly after 1512 because they were partially cut through that layer of ash, but before 1519, 1520, which is when the chapel was built. The first and most complete of these individuals was an adult woman who was around 40 years old. And she was actually incredibly interesting because she was buried in a coffin. And we know that from the survival of coffin nails around her body. And also clearly from the scientific analysis that was undertaken by my amazing colleagues at the University of Cardiff, 8 more than she required, was born outside of London before moving to the tower. And frequently consumed sugars and various other things. So all of this stuff sounds like, oh, well, that's just nothing really. But what it tells us is that the community of the tower is one that is drawn from all over the country. People are moving around and then ending up at the tower. But particularly this woman was clearly of not incredible status, but certainly elevated status. She had the means in order to purchase a coffin, which are usually kind of reusable items that you process someone with and then are removed from for your burial. And having access to sugars, like fruits and things like that, just showed that she had more money. On the other hand, we also excavated the remains of a juvenile male who showed almost the complete opposite. So similarly, was born in the north, moved into inland, and then moved to the Tower of London before dying. But clearly had a period of stress, which may be caused by illness, may be caused by malnutrition, various other things, but did not consume as much food as he needed. Also did not have access to sugars and things like that. So, and also in the actual kind of archaeology of the burial, was simply buried in a shroud. And we know that from corrosion marks on different parts of the skeleton, where copper pins are used to hold the shroud or blanket, effectively, that you're wrapped in, but also from the position of the skeleton. If you're buried in a coffin, and a slight disclaimer, we're going to talk about bones. If you're buried in a coffin, there's space on either side of your head. So what tends to happen is that your muscles and your tendons will rot away and your head will roll to one side and your jaw will drop. And so it's usually fairly obvious if someone's buried in a coffin. If you're buried in a shroud, earth is packed in on all sides of you at the time of burial. And so your remains actually stay pretty much in the correct position that you were laid in. And so this shows that we have low status children who are moving to the tower for whatever reason, but also higher status women who are also presumably living at the tower. We aren't able to say what these individuals did for work or who they were related to or things like that. But what we were using this scientific analysis for is to prove just how much information you can actually get out of doing this kind of analysis on human remains in the context of the tower. And it raises all kinds of questions. Neither of these individuals consumed a huge amount of marine food, which is slightly odd because we're next to the river. And so it raises questions about what the food supply for the fortress is, and all of these kinds of other kind of weird and wonderful questions that you're able to ask and answer using modern scientific analysis. The third individual that we found was just a pair of feet that had been cut through by another burial. And so we didn't do any analysis on those remains because we have to balance the ethics of destructive testing and what information we're going to gain. And so there wasn't enough of that individual in order to justify doing the analysis that we did. What's really exciting about this excavation is that we have excavated the remains of 22 individuals dating from probably the 13th century to around the 17th century, alongside charnel, which could be up to 50 additional individuals. And there will be questions about how we approach the sampling and testing of charnel. But what this body of evidence will enable us to create much more kind of broad conclusions about who these people are, where they come from, what they're eating, how they're living, how they're moving. You can look at the pathology of individuals' bones to see how they've moved in their life. There's also a collection of burials from the 14th century, which appear to be slightly rushed in comparison to the others. And obviously there's a fairly large event in 14th century being the Black Death. And so we will be doing DNA testing for Yersinia pestis, which is the bacteria that causes the plague. And this is particularly interesting because there is a Black Death cemetery just to the northeast of the tower where the War and Mint buildings now are. And so if these are Black Death burials, they will be very, very early ones that are not making use of that cemetery. And so we will be able to look more both at what the community of the tower is like, but also at how that community is interacting with London, how it's interacting with the kind of broader medieval England, and in some cases, even kind of the world. So there was one burial, which is probably the most exciting that we found, who was buried with two kind of pots filled with incense. And this is completely remarkable because burial goods in medieval England aren't usually a thing. This kind of burial practice occurs much more commonly in Denmark and northern France, Normandy. And so it looks like this may be an individual who is either traveling from one of those places or has moved from one of those places and has either left instruction for their burial, or the people at the tower knew where they were from, knew their traditions, and actually honoured kind of what they would feel would be their burial rites. And so it's obviously too early to say anything now, and this analysis will take years. And I mean, particularly the analysis of DNA will potentially allow us to create facial reconstructions. We may be able to look at medieval people from the Tower of London, which will be amazing at kind of bringing the fortress to life. But kind of the opportunity is endless. And it all has to be couched in that idea of dignity and respect. We have to make sure that whatever testing we're doing has a very clear and justifiable output. But it is a generational opportunity to be able to understand the people of the tower, which are usually the element of the fortress that is forgotten. And that's what the great joy of St. Peter ad Vincula is. Every other building on the site, whether it's the White Tower or the King's House, has been a store, they've been homes, they've been prisons, they've been anything, you name it. It's the reason the tower is still here is because it's useful. The chapel has only ever been a chapel, and it's only ever been a chapel since at least the 12th century. And so all of the stories of the tower are included in that story because religion is of such pivotal importance during that period. So it's a fulcrum for the community that we really don't have anywhere else. And this excavation will allow us to kind of dive into that with more detail than has ever been revealed before.
That is fascinating. And I have to say that one of the most engaging and humbling aspects of reading your research is that you are uncovering the lives of people I wouldn't be able to find in the archive. The keeping of parish records isn't compulsory till 1538. So my chances of finding these people are negligible. And I think it's a really amazing opportunity to tell the stories of people that might be lost to time otherwise. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about incorporating these stories into the overall narrative? Can we expect to see some of this research?
I hope so. I very much hope so. It will depend on many different things. But you make an incredibly important point. And it's not even just that these are people that don't exist in the records. It's the principle that most people will be known from birth and baptism, marriage and death. So that's not a lot of information to go off. Whereas the scientific analysis that we do, in collaboration with the University of Cardiff and various other institutions, can tell us when an individual was weaned. So when you were taken off breast milk and given solid food for the first time, where you weren't born is the best way of putting it in terms of isotopic analysis, how you moved throughout your life, what kind of food you ate at different points in your life. And so it's not just these are people that you won't be able to access. These are people that you won't be able to access, but we can also access a huge amount more information than you could ever get from any kind of traditional archival research. And the archival research is incredibly important and factors into it, but it's just an incredible opportunity. In terms of how we will relate that to visitor experience, Historic Royal Palaces at the moment is going through a kind of sea change in how we tell stories. We pride ourselves on being the best storytellers at historic sites, and I think we're rightly proud of that. But there's always more to do, and particularly we are using the phrases kind of to reach further and to mean more. So how can we engage with different communities in different ways? How can we enable our storytelling to mean more to individual people? And it's this kind of analysis that brings the humanity really back into the historic record, when how people are breastfed, how people are buried, how people mourn their loved ones, that will enable us to tell an absolutely incredible story of the people who are at the Tower of London, rather than, oh yes, Edward I built this wall. No, he didn't. Huge numbers of work people, huge numbers of craftspeople, of administrators are living, working and dying at the fortress. And so we will be able to tell their stories. We may be able to do that in a number of different ways. There's obviously typical text panels and things like that. And there will definitely be information that could be translated into something like updated panels in the Medieval Palace or something like that. But the gold standard would be, how can we actually take the artifacts that we've recovered? And I said earlier about sieving in order to retrieve human remains from all of the spoil that we excavated. The kind of unintended happy consequence of that is that we also found everything else because everything was passed through a sieve. So we found objects that have never been found at the Tower of London before, including painted and stained glass, medieval jewellery, shroud pins, which are just the most delicate little things. And they are the last thing that, regardless of whether or not you're buried in a coffin or buried in shroud burials are the most common. The last thing someone does for you, apart from bury you, is to pin that shroud in place. And so these very small kind of mundane objects are kind of imbued with so much more meaning. But symbols, pins, beads, book clasps, anything and everything, literally thousands of things that relate to everyday life, both at the tower and before the tower, including very exciting, potentially Anglo-Saxon glass bead. But what would be really nice is finding a way of sharing those objects, and the way in which archaeologists and historians, and I'd like to think I straddle both, use material culture in conjunction with archival records to understand the past. And going even further than that, we may be able to do things that we've never done before. Historical Palaces has never created complete 3D representations of individuals using kind of DNA sequencing and analysis of human remains, because we've never excavated human remains before, at least not in the 21st century, and not complete skeletons. And so the sky's the limit, really. There will be things that will be shared in terms of visitor experience. The most important thing to do first, though, is the due diligence. It's the actual work. And so for the next, presumably around 5 years, I will be commissioning scientists to fire lipids at bits of vitrified or burnt pot in order to work out what kind of deposits are actually on there, what kind of incense was in those pots that were buried with that individual. What can the isotopic analysis tell us about where these individuals are from and how they move throughout their life? The actual analysis of the small finds. What date is the jewellery? What date is this stained glass? How does that work with the stratigraphy or the layers in the earth and the deposits of buildings that we've encountered to create this fully fleshed story? And all of that will, I hope, form the basis of probably multiple publications. I would hope a book. If not a book, then at least a number of different peer-reviewed journal articles. And it's through doing all of that detailed research that we can then pull out the kind of stories that will engage people, will speak to different elements of our society and represent elements of the tower's history that aren't represented elsewhere. So all of the work that we're doing is based around that cause, to try and engage people and to reach further, mean more, and share those incredible stories. It's just, there's obviously a delay between the rigorous historical, archaeological, scientific work and then the equally rigorous kind of analysis of audiences and how we can share them and where we share these stories and all of that kind of stuff. But it's going to be exciting. It would just take time.
You're going to be a busy boy.
Yes, effectively, I have signed myself up for at least another half decade of studying the chapel, which is no real great shame for me. But no, and it will revolutionize everything else that everything I've published on the chapel, apart from the legal thing, now is quite severely out of date following this excavation. And so it'll be a great privilege for me it's a great privilege to lead this excavation because it's so big and so important, and is probably the most significant excavation certainly the most significant excavation that's happened in the inner ward of the tower for about 50 years. It's probably one of the more important that's happened at the tower, full stop. And so it's a great privilege to lead the team that has done this work, but also to help manage the team of different specialists and individuals who will draw out those stories and create that kind of narrative that we can then, my colleagues can then use to kind of interpret and engage people with. So yeah, really good. But you feel the weight of history on you a little bit at the tower, because it's work. Everything's always work. Hever Castle is work. But there's a particular significance to this job and doing it right. And because it is my favourite building, I feel a particular burden to do all I can to both preserve the archaeology that we found via record and also share it.
That's really amazing. It feels like such an amazing opportunity for people to come to a place they might not feel at home at and experience the stories of individuals who peopled this place that they might feel a closer connection to than kings and queens.
No, absolutely. And it's something that we are constantly trying to update and include in the interpretations that we share at the tower. So our medieval palace refresh includes many more stories about both people of diverse backgrounds and particularly diverse religious backgrounds, and telling more inclusive stories so people can see themselves in our history. But that is extended across interpretation panels that you will see around the site, and also in our research outputs, so our publications and in our blogs and various other things. So we are always trying to make... People have always been people, and there have always been different people. And so it is our job as historians and curators to ensure that people are able to see their past in these often quite monolithic and intimidating places. No one comes to the Tower of London thinking, oh yes, wonderful, this is going to be a really cheery kind of day. Most people come here thinking, okay, divorced beheaded died, divorced beheaded survived, expulsion of the Jews in 1290, various other horrifying elements of our history. But it is our job to talk about all of the people who have passed through this place, not just Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII, Edward I, etc., etc., etc. However important those stories are, and those stories will still be shared, we are adding layers to them. We're not removing narratives, we are adding to the narrative.
It sounds like you're going to be incredibly busy for the next 5 years. I'd like to talk a little bit about your future. Do you have any aspirations for future digs? This was a once in a lifetime opportunity and has set amazing precedents. What's next for you?
This is one of the great curses of my life, is being the kind of resident archaeologist of the Tower. And as I say, I'm a buildings archaeologist and I straddle history and archaeology. But any time I speak to members of the public, to some of the front of house staff and some of our yeomen, I mean, everybody obviously gets incredibly excited when we do this kind of excavation because they happen once every 30 or 40 years. But the main thing people say to me is, wouldn't you love to dig it all up? Where are you going to dig next? My role as Curator of Historic Buildings at the Tower is to be the advocate for the site. It's to be the person who is not necessarily the fun sponge, but can occasionally be the fun sponge, but challenging people to think creatively about how we might do things in different ways in order to preserve the site. My golden rule is, well, all of our golden rule and Historical Palace's golden rule is, if we don't need to dig, we don't dig. Because as I said, archaeology is a destructive process. You can never put deposits back over the top of each other. And they are always safer where they are. And the principal problem with the excavations in 1876 is, and particularly the human remains that are excavated during that work, is that they were assessed using phrenology, which is looking at measurements of bones to tell how beautiful and how intelligent somebody is. This is proven to be wrong, and almost every single reassessment of skeletal assemblages from the Victorian period that have been reassessed have been found to be something completely different. This is most obvious in kind of Viking warrior burials that turn out to be women and things like that. It's also used in incredibly racist ways to create stereotypes of certain peoples being less intelligent than others. And you can't, it's horrible that that happened. However, you can't really say, oh, well, why didn't they do DNA testing? Didn't know DNA existed. Why didn't they do isotopic testing? The means of doing that work didn't exist. The body of specialist knowledge and of scientific analysis that I can draw upon is infinitely larger and more complex than that in 1876. However, in 3025, the body of scientific analysis and research that will be available to whoever is then curator of the Tower will be infinitely more vast and complex than I have access to. And so we always want to leave as much as we can in the ground, because we don't know that one day someone isn't going to be able to just plot something on it, scan it, understand exactly what's there, and then they can leave it alone forever. And we are damaging the site by performing excavations. So there will be more digs in the future. They definitely will not be of the scale that this one was. And I think that's rightly so, because we've done this work because, and this was summarized for me by one of my brilliant colleagues in the interpretation team, the work to enable access to the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula makes a place that is of everyone for everyone. And it has always been of everyone. It is all of the different stories of the Tower. And so the benefit outweighs the damage to the archaeology. in enabling anybody who wants to come to the chapel, whether or not that's for a service, whether or not it's for a wedding, for a baptism. If you are in a wheelchair and your child is being baptized at the tower, next year you will be able to attend without having to be carried down a set of stairs. That is a justifiable argument to destroy some of the site's archaeology, effectively. And it's destroyed physically. It will be recorded and shared and preserved in the records that we create. We don't really have that argument elsewhere at the moment. That may change in time. We may think up of different ways to share different elements of the site. But what historic royal palaces do not do is research excavations. Because while incredibly valuable, as I say, we don't know that in 100 years' time someone couldn't do a better job. And so leaving what we can for the future is a core part of what Historic Royal Palaces does. It is part of the role of our charity's existence that we hand these sites onto the next generation, and that includes their archaeology. So what's next for me is a huge amount of research and briefing specialists and reading scientific reports and various other things and trying to make some semblance of sense out of them. Collating all of that information into a publication, and then with the interpretation team and various others, drawing elements out that we can then share both on the site and further afield. During that, I will be curator of the tower. I will continue to be advising on the kind of bread and butter, which is conservation and maintenance projects. There will be digs to a lesser degree, and there will be building, recording, and various other things, but there will be nothing on this scale for the foreseeable future.
Alfred, it has been a real joy to witness this ongoing work and to speak to you about it today. Thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me and for sharing this, and particularly sharing this at a point at which almost none of the analysis has been done. And so I can't make any sweeping great conclusions. I can't say, behold, this is now the history of the chapel. But it's even by doing things like this that enable us to share our stories more widely, because the tower can't move. And so being able to take the stories of the tower to other people through other means is a wonderful opportunity. So thank you for having me. And another thing to say is that while I am the face of this excavation, for some reasons that I don't quite understand, it was a absolutely huge collaborative effort. So there are massive thanks to the Surveyor of the Fabric team, to the press team who have been overseeing everything that we're doing and the way in which we're doing it and how we're sharing it and how we're recording it and everything else. The interpretation team who are already thinking about how we use this information. The archaeologists themselves who were brought in for what they thought would be probably around a 10-week excavation, which then subsequently became 30 weeks of sieving soil, and did an absolutely heroic and incredibly professional job. The chaplain of the tower, without whose support we never could have done it, alongside architects, designers, engineers, ground workers. It's one of the amazing things about working here is that although typically it's the curator who's, hello, look what I've discovered, isn't this amazing? It's the kind of daily work with a collection of exceptional people, that every one of which is kind of the best at what they do, that makes this place really wonderful. And so I just wanted to be able to kind of shout some of them out very quickly.
Thank you.